Good morning. My name is Leila Abed. I'm the Deputy Director of the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our roundtable discussion on the National Guard and the militarization of Mexican security. During his electoral campaign, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador promised to return the armed forces to their barracks and to replace the federal police with a National Guard. In 2019, Mexico's Congress approved the National Guard law, creating a new organism under the civilian command of the Ministry of Security and Civilian Protection. While the National Guard's tasks reflected those of a civil body, since its inception, it has been heavily influenced by the military, with over 150,000 troops deployed throughout the country, and more than 70% of its members and commanders belong to the armed forces. In May 2020, a presidential decree officially extended the National Guard's responsibilities to include public security duties for a 5-year period or until 2024. In August 2022, President López Obrador proposed to fully incorporate the National Guard into the Ministry of National Defense, also known as SEDENA, absolving it from its civilian responsibilities. The bill to give the Army control over the National Guard was ratified in its majority by lawmakers in both chambers from the governing party, Morena, and with the support of one opposition party, the PRI. In response, other opposition leaders and civil society organizations have pledged to challenge the bill in the Supreme Court for violating the Constitution. From 2007 to 2022, the budget allocated to the armed forces increased 60.5%. In 2021, SEDENA received a budget equivalent to $5.6 billion in comparison to $4 billion in 2018, the year AMLO took office. The armed forces have not only expanded their list of duties, but their economic power has grown as well. In addition, last week, Mexico's lower house of Congress voted to extend the Army's presence on the streets for 5 more years, that is, until 2028, effectively setting in motion what many consider the militarization of Mexican public security. Our excellent group of panelists will analyze the implications and potential consequences of transferring the National Guard to the Mexican Armed Forces and what this means for the future of the country's security. But before we get started with our conversation, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items for our virtual audience. We have simultaneous translation available. Please press the globe button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to choose the language of your preference. We also encourage our viewers to send questions to our panelists via our Twitter account at Mexico Institute or to our email, mexicoinstitute@wilsoncenter.org. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of our conversation. And now I will have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. I do want to note that due to an unexpected family emergency, Chap Lawson unfortunately will not be joining us, but the rest of our wonderful panelists are here with us today. For the sake of time, I will read an abbreviated version of each of their biographies. Dr. Craig Deer has served on the faculty of the National Defense University since January 2001. Dr. Deer served in the U.S. Army for 20 years with a variety of assignments, specializing in military intelligence and Latin American Foreign Area Officer duties. He served as a deputy commander of the Joint Counterintelligence Operations Element in Honduras in 1986, after which he attended graduate school with a subsequent assignment as an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He subsequently served as an assistant defense attaché in Mexico City in the early 90s, as a troop commander of a special operations unit, and spent 2 years as a senior country director in the Office of Inter-American Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he was responsible for crafting defense policy matters for Mexico. Alejandro Hope is a security consultant and partner at GEA Grupo de Economistas y Asociados, a Mexico City-based political and economic consulting firm. From 2014 to 2016, he served as editor at eldailypost.com, an English language online news site devoted to Mexico. From 2011 to 2014, he worked as director for security policy at the Mexican Competitiveness Institute, IMCO, a Mexican City-based think tank. Between 2008 and 2011, he held several executive positions at the Center for Research and National Security, CISEN, Mexico's civilian intelligence agency. Prior to CISEN, he was partner for 7 years at GEA Grupo de Economistas y Asociados. Maureen Mayer serves as WALA's Vice President for Programs, working with senior staff to develop policy priorities and strategies to advance human rights and social justice in Latin America. Prior to assuming this position in 2020, Ms. Mayer spent 14 years leading WALA's Mexico's program with a special focus on analyzing US-Mexico security policies and their relation to organized crime-related violence, corruption, and human rights violations in Mexico. She also advocated for greater protections for migrants and asylum seekers in Mexico at the US-Mexico border. From 2006 to 2013, she supported WALA's work on human rights and democracy in Latin America. Maria Elena Morera has been a civilian activist since 2001 and is a speaker, columnist, and opinion leader in Mexico. From 2003 to 2009, she presided over the organization México Unidos contra la Delincuencia. She is currently president of Causa Común, a civil organization dedicated to strengthening citizen participation, as well as promoting mechanisms for government transparency and accountability that strengthen the rule of law in Mexico. And finally, Duncan Wood is Vice President for Strategy and New Initiatives and Senior Advisor to the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. He's an internationally renowned specialist on North American politics, Mexico, and US-Mexican ties, who lectures and publishes on hemispheric issues and relations. He regularly gives testimony to the US Congress on US-Mexico relations and is a widely quoted source on Mexican politics and has published extensively on this and other issues. And now we will begin our discussion. I just kindly ask our panelists to keep their comments brief. And I will start with Maria Elena Morera. I just want to let our audience know that I will be switching between Spanish and English, so bear with me. But again, we do have simultaneous translation. So, Maria Elena Morera, voy a hablar contigo en español y me gustaría iniciar y arrancar esta discusión con una pregunta un poco general, pero que tú has escrito mucho sobre este asunto y me parece muy importante para la conversación del día de hoy. El proceso de la militarización del presidente López Obrador corre, a tu parecer, el riesgo de convertir a la seguridad de México a uno de militarismo. ¿Cuáles son las implicaciones reales a la seguridad de México de expandir el poder de las Fuerzas Armadas sobre las civiles? Y perdón que te haga una pregunta adicional, sé que nada más tenemos muy pocos minutos, pero me encantaría saber si tú consideras que es inconstitucional tanto lo que ha hecho el presidente López Obrador como el Congreso de la Unión.
Muchas gracias, Lila. Gracias por la invitación. Me da mucho gusto estar esta mañana en esta mesa. Y pues te responderé pues de manera breve a lo que ha estado pasando. El proceso de militarización del presidente López Obrador, por supuesto que corre riesgos en la seguridad mexicana y por supuesto que estamos entrando en un proceso de militarismo. Yo lo pondría de esta manera. Si bien el militarismo se considera en la seguridad pública como la forma en que los militares están entrando a hacer tareas que no están dentro de su ámbito de competencia, pero que sin embargo sí se lo pusieron en su ámbito de competencia en el 2019 con la ley de la Guardia Nacional. Sin embargo, tenemos que decirlo con todas sus letras, que este proceso se está hoy entrelazando con el proceso de militarismo. Si vemos el proceso de militarización, este se ha ido construyendo a través del tiempo, pero principalmente en este sexenio, en dos niveles. Primero, a nivel federal, con la ley de la Guardia Nacional que les decía, donde le dieron las 43 funciones de la Policía Federal a la Guardia Nacional, pero como lo tenemos documentado, nunca cumplieron con la función de formar a su personal como policía. Realmente fue un fraude a la Constitución. La Guardia Nacional es civil, como dice la Constitución, pero en la práctica nunca nació. Y legalmente sí se quedaron con estas funciones ahora que pasaron la Guardia Nacional a la Sedena, y con esto pues contesto tu última pregunta. ¿Es ilegal este paso? Por supuesto que es ilegal porque está fuera del marco de la Constitución. El segundo nivel de militarización es a nivel de las policías locales. Al menos a 56 militares hemos visto que están ocupando cargos de alto nivel en las secretarías de seguridad pública, tanto estatales como municipales. Estas instituciones están adquiriendo una cultura castrense. ¿Y por qué decimos esto? Porque están perdiendo las capacidades propias de la policía como el criterio para tomar decisiones en el momento, la resolución de conflictos entre los ciudadanos, por ejemplo, o la cercanía con la gente. Entonces, la militarización responde a las preguntas: ¿quién hace las funciones de seguridad y cómo lo hace? Hoy, gran parte de nuestras policías, y sobre todo a nivel federal, pues está tomada por los militares. El segundo proceso es el del militarismo, que responde básicamente a la pregunta: ¿quién decide sobre quién en el sistema político? Entonces, con las más de 150 responsabilidades civiles que este presidente les ha otorgado a las Fuerzas Armadas, tenemos, por ejemplo, pues la obra pública más importante del sexenio, el control operativo de puertos, de aeropuertos, de trenes, incluso el control de la aviación civil, el reparto de apoyos sociales, entre otras muchas. Entonces, esto responde a la pregunta por sí misma, ¿no? ¿Quién está teniendo control sobre quién? Pues definitivamente hoy los militares tienen mucho más control sobre el poder civil de lo que tenían en años anteriores. Además, para estas responsabilidades se les están dando asignaciones de recursos que no llegan por la asignación de la Cámara de Diputados, sino que llegan por vías distintas, como son donaciones, fideicomisos, ingresos extrapresupuestales y hasta negocios. Me iría rápido a contestar cuáles son las implicaciones de expandir el poder de las Fuerzas Armadas sobre las fuerzas civiles, y aquí hago una acotación sobre todo de la Sedena, no tanto de Marina. A la Sedena es a la que le han dado mucho más atribuciones y mucho más recursos económicos. Lo pondría en 4 puntos. El primero es que el uso de las Fuerzas Armadas en tareas de seguridad pública no mejoran la seguridad. Se ha venido demostrando desde hace 3 lustros y en este sexenio principalmente a través de la Guardia Nacional, que no funcionó como una institución de seguridad pública civil. Además, aumenta las violaciones a los derechos humanos. El segundo punto es que debido a que no están sometidas a las mismas reglas que están sometidas en transparencia y rendición de cuentas las instituciones civiles, pues entonces amplifica el riesgo de corrupción en el ejercicio del presupuesto y deja en opacidad muchas de las violaciones a los derechos humanos que cometen. El tercer punto, el fortalecimiento de las Fuerzas Armadas, sin duda ocurre en detrimento de las policías que trabajan en condiciones deplorables. Y el cuarto punto, y me parece que este es muy importante respecto al militarismo, es que el poder económico y político que ya tienen las Fuerzas Armadas atenta contra los derechos, las libertades y la democracia, como nos lo ha hecho sentir el secretario Luis Crescencio Sandoval en sus posturas políticas, donde igual nos advierte que debemos estar todos en favor del proyecto político en curso, o nos descalifica a quienes estamos preocupados por la militarización. Hasta aquí lo dejaría. Gracias.
Gracias, María Elena. Alejandro, me gustaría continuar contigo. Sabemos que el enfoque en estos momentos está sobre la militarización de los cuerpos civiles a nivel federal, pero esta tendencia también ha tenido un impacto a nivel estatal y municipal, tal como hizo referencia ahorita María Elena Morera, en particular en cuanto a la designación del presupuesto. Entonces, mi pregunta hacia ti es, debido a que gran parte de la lucha contra la inseguridad se realiza en los estados, ¿la militarización podría ayudar a combatir la inseguridad o generaría incentivos peligrosos para los funcionarios locales? Es decir, ¿es inevitable el derrame de la militarización a nivel federal en los estados o los gobernadores tienen la facultad real de adoptar una estrategia distinta a la del Ejecutivo?
Bueno, primero que nada, buenos días a todo el panel, buenos días a todos los que nos acompañan en esta reunión. A ver, déjame plantearlo de este modo. Lo que sabemos es que hay un problema de fondo con la Guardia Nacional, además, digamos, de su deriva militarista, y es que realiza funciones que son sustitutivas y no complementarias de las fuerzas policiales estatales y locales. Según datos incluidos en el reporte, en el informe anual que entregó la Guardia Nacional al Senado de la República a inicios de este año, más o menos 99% de los de las detenciones que realiza la Guardia Nacional son en flagrancia. Solo, según misma fuente, solo realizó en 2021 14 detenciones como resultado de acciones de inteligencia. Entonces, prácticamente detuvieron a 50 personas por delincuencia organizada o operaciones de operaciones de dinero de procedencia ilícita. Es decir, lo que tenemos es una policía que básicamente patrulla y no investiga. Es decir, que hace más o menos lo mismo que hacen las policías estatales y municipales. Y lo hace además con unos niveles de eficiencia que son pues, realmente muy limitados. En todo 2021 tuvieron 8.500 personas. Para poner eso en perspectiva, las policías municipales en su conjunto, que son más o menos 180,000 elementos, en todo el país, 190,000, detuvieron a 150,000 personas. Pusieron a disposición del Ministerio Público 150,000 personas. La Guardia Nacional, con 108,000 elementos, 210,000 elementos que tenía el año pasado, pusieron a disposición del Ministerio Público 8.500 personas. De hecho, la Policía Federal en su último año de operación, con 3 veces menos elementos que la Guardia Nacional, puso a disposición del Ministerio Público a 21,000 personas. Entonces, esta es una policía que hace lo mismo que hacen las policías municipales y estatales, pero que no complementa capacidades y además lo hace con bastante reticencia a hacer labor de policía. Aquí hay una cosa que es bien interesante, ¿no? Las Fuerzas Armadas han insistido en que se les otorguen facultades para ser policías, pero no las ejercen una vez que las tienen. Yo he oído, y Marilena seguro las ha oído también, decenas de anécdotas donde los guardias nacionales se niegan categóricamente a firmar puestos a disposición. Le piden a los policías estatales y municipales que lo hagan. Entonces, esto sí, entonces primero, no sirve gran cosa, no añade mucho a la capacidad que ya existe. No complementa las capacidades que ya están desplegadas en el territorio, pero sí genera un incentivo perverso. Para los exgobernadores, para los alcaldes, pues es mucho más sencillo agarrar el teléfono, pedirle al presidente que le manden elementos de la Guardia Nacional que dedicar recursos y capital político a construir capacidades propias. Déjame dar un par de ejemplos ahí muy concretos. Finales del año pasado, el presidente fue a Sonora y en la reunión, la conferencia de prensa mañanera que tuvo en Hermosillo, estaba allí el gobernador, Alfonso Durazo, antes secretario de Seguridad Federal, y allí el gobernador Durazo dijo que ellos tenían planeados duplicar el tamaño de su policía estatal, pero que ya no lo iban a hacer porque el presidente ya les había prometido mandar más elementos de la Guardia Nacional. Segundo ejemplo. Hace un mes y medio más o menos, la jefa de gobierno de la Ciudad de México, la doctora Claudia Sheinbaum, puso un tuit agradeciéndole a la Guardia Nacional y al Ejército Mexicano su colaboración en el operativo de tránsito vinculado a la línea 1 del metro. Como contexto, se cerró una línea del metro de la Ciudad de México y entonces desviaron a esos pasajeros del metro a autobuses. Entonces, la colaboración de estos elementos militares vestidos con uniforme táctico y arma larga fue decir a los pasajeros, el autobús se toma en la siguiente esquina. Entonces, de nuevo, es en una ciudad que además tiene 80,000 policías propios, ¿no? Hay un efecto de sustitución, hay un efecto de traslado de responsabilidades hacia la Guardia Nacional y además hay un efecto en el cual es mejor no invertir en capacidades porque pues, es mejor transferir la responsabilidad al de enfrente. Y último punto, ya con esto ya termino. Si hay un problema con la militarización, hay un bucle de retroalimentación con el nombramiento de oficiales militares en puestos de seguridad pública en los estados. Como no hay, como los gobernadores o los alcaldes prefieren hablar del secretario de la Defensa o prefieren hablar del secretario de la Marina, para nombrar a un oficial como secretario de seguridad, como su jefe de policía. Entonces no hay espacios para mandos civiles. Y como no hay espacios para mandos civiles, no va a haber un incentivo para que se formen esos mandos civiles. Entonces, pasados algunos años, simplemente no va a haber mandos civiles de los entre los cuales escoger, sino va a haber simplemente militares, no va a haber otra alternativa. Yo creo que ahí es un circuito de retroalimentación que habría que pensar hacia el futuro. Muchas gracias.
Sumamente interesante, Alejandro, y más eso que mencionas sobre el liderazgo, ¿no? De un civil versus un liderazgo militar, y también me quedo con una policía que patrulla pero no investiga. Me parece que también es sumamente alarmante esa frase que mencionaste. I'm going to pivot to English again, and it's not because he doesn't have excellent Spanish, but Duncan Wood, you were in Mexico City this past weekend on September 16th and heard the speech that AMLO gave during the Independence Day military parade, which this year had a more militaristic air given the recent developments. But days before the speech, AMLO announced that he had changed opinions and that he was no longer going to talk about the USMCA panel that the US and Canada has initiated against Mexico's energy policies. Instead, he proposed a plan, a peace plan for Ukraine to the United Nations General Assembly. He pleaded for Julian Assange's release and celebrated the transfer of the National Guard to Sedena. What was your reaction to this speech, to AMLO's message, and what was it like being there in Mexico City during this parade?
So thank you, Leila, and it's great to be on this panel with so many distinguished thinkers about Mexico. I have to say it's my first time I've ever attended the Desfile Militar in Mexico, and it's an impressive occasion, less for the presence of the military than for the sense of excitement and participation of the public. In that sense, I have to say, I think it's, before I attended it, I thought, you know, I don't like military parades, but this was an opportunity for citizens of Mexico City to actually get closer to the military in a friendlier environment. My favorite moment was I was walking along Reforma, and there was a military truck there that would actually had horno de pan. They were making bread in a military truck, and I thought, you know, the old Roman saying of bread and circus really comes to mind here. But there was a feeling of festivity on the streets of Mexico City about the Desfile Militar. And, you know, a lot of people still celebrating from the night before, from the grito. But in terms of the president's speech, I have to say that it all depends on what audience you're looking at, right? If we're looking at a US or global audience, that speech is completely tone deaf. It does nothing to increase trust or confidence in Mexico. It goes completely against the overwhelming direction of public opinion in the United States, Canada, around the world, on Ukraine, on Julian Assange, etc. And the fact is that, you know, AMLO once again is making his statement as a Mexican nationalist, but he's really directing that speech not to the global audience, but to his domestic audience. And I think there's a lot of folks in Mexico who maybe didn't care that much about it, but they listen to the president and they say, okay, well, if the president believes this, then maybe I'm going to go along with it. And I think this is all part of his extraordinary capacity to communicate with the Mexican people and to really bring them along with him. The interesting thing is that his change in tone from earlier on in, well, from a couple of weeks ago, with regards to USMCA issues and the consultation, that reflects the fact, I think, that number one, the United States has pushed back. Number two, that his anti-Yanquismo that came through in his reaction to the request for a consultation didn't go down well in terms of public opinion in Mexico. And in that sense, his communication capacities actually reached a limit, I would say. And because of that, I think he's begun to pull back from that more strident, nationalistic, anti-Yankee approach that he had initially. Although today I've just seen in the summary of the Mañanera that he's defending the right to nationalize industry under Article 27 of the Constitution. Let me shift over to the question of the Guardia Nacional and the militarization of Mexico. And I'd like to introduce some ideas, which I'm sure that Maureen and Craig will speak about in greater detail. And that is to do with the issue of trust. Maria Elena has already spoken about whether or not this damages Mexican trust in public security forces in Mexico, questions of governance and transparency. I agree 100% with everything that she said there. She said it much better than I would. So shifting to the United States, I would say that the real risk, I think, from the increasing militarization of Mexico, and in particular, essentially what is moving from civilian control of the military to military control of civilian or public security, is that we have the questions of governance, of transparency, of accountability that are going to be severely questioned here in Washington. There will be voices here who say we don't really care if, as long as it does the job in reducing the flow of drugs, as long as it does the job in terms of reducing violence. But there are many rules and regulations to which Craig and Maureen can speak more eloquently than me that will limit the ability of the United States to cooperate with Mexican public security forces if there is further corruption of the military, as Maria Elena has suggested. And I think that's the real risk here, is that if we take if we pan back and we take a 30,000-foot view of the security relationship between Mexico and the United States over the last 40 to 50 years, the fundamental issue has always been trust. And there have been moments where we've built higher levels of trust, and there have been moments where we've fallen rapidly back. And I fear that we're in one of those moments right now where we're going backwards. That once again, we're asking the question, okay, who can we actually trust on the other side of this negotiating table? Who do we work with, not just to get things done, but to guarantee that the intelligence that we're sharing with them isn't shared with the wrong voices? And I fear that that's very much at risk right now with what we're seeing with the militarization of public security in Mexico. I'll stop there, Lila.
Thank you, Duncan. It's extremely interesting that you were there, kind of your idea of why he mentioned, all of these issues during his speech. And I think trust is definitely the fundamental issue in terms of security cooperation between the United States and Mexico. And kind of staying on that train of thought, Dr. Deer, you have done extensive research on the historical evolution of the militaries, both of the United States and Mexico. In recent years, Mexico's armed forces have cooperated deeply with their US counterparts, but President López Obrador has based his foreign policy on the principle of non-intervention, and there has been a subsequent deterioration in US-Mexico security cooperation. In your opinion, would empowering Mexico's armed forces help or jeopardize Mexico's relationship with the US on cross-border security issues?
So first, thanks for the invitation to be on the panel, interview with these very well-known colleagues. The short answer to the question, of course, is that it is not helpful at all. I think Duncan just made a critically important point with the issue of trust, and that trust that had begun to be developed back in the 90s when William Perry visited for the first time, and then in subsequent years, how that continued to improve. And I think, of course, the precursor to this gradual erosion of trust that Duncan just referred to, we have to, of course, mention the arrest of General Cienfuegos in October of 18, I think it was. And so that sort of threw a brake on it for a second. The brake was released, but there has been an erosion of trust from that moment on. And so the one concept that I'd like to add that I haven't heard, despite everything that Maria Elena has said, which I agree with, and of course Alejandro as well, is the issue of legitimacy. And the loss of legitimacy of the armed forces to some of the public in Mexico, but I think in terms of the bilateral relationship, is a concern to officials in the Biden administration. That's a problem. And I'm not sure if you're going to ask this question, but let me throw it out there and perhaps we can build on it later. The question is why, right? If we go back to when AMLO was campaigning, and it was no secret that there was not a lot of love lost between AMLO and the armed forces, especially the Army, for a number of reasons. And of course, he was going to return him to the barracks and take him out of the war on drugs, et cetera. And not only has he not done that, as Maria Elena talked about, he's given all these civilian tasks to the military. And that's what raises this issue of illegitimacy. And why? I think you can be conspiratorial if you'd like, but I think the simple answer may just be politics, pure and simple. And because, building a legitimate federal police force is long and hard and expensive and difficult. And the original idea of creating maybe an intermediate force, a la Gendarmerie or Carabinieri or Guardia Civil, would make sense. Just operationalizing the Guardia Nacional and changing it from what should be the carácter civil, as Maria Elena talked about, and seguridad pública, right? Not seguridad interior. The why is because the armed forces are well respected and liked, and because in the short term it satisfies AMLO's political needs, but it certainly undermines, I think, the security and well-being of the country, and it undermines the legitimacy of the armed forces as they go forward. And that's not only troubling for the bilateral relationship, but for the fundamental security and well-being of the country. And I'll stop there.
Dr. Deere, I think you brought up an essential question. It's kind of understanding motives behind it. Panelists here this morning. I would like to continue with Maureen and exactly what Dr. Deere just mentioned on the troubles that this can have on the U.S.-Mexico relation. Mexican soldiers have been deployed since 2006 to conduct public security duties. I think Maria Elena Morera made reference to this. But since then, the armed forces have been accused of human rights violations, such as executions, forced disappearances, arbitrary detentions of civilians, which Alejandro also touched upon, and the use of torture, often with complete impunity while failing to reduce violence levels across the country. So what are the risks of transferring public security duties to the military, and what can be done to strengthen the rule of law, impunity, and corruption in Mexico? I mean, it's a big question.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and great to be with you all today. I think in terms of your question, it's important to highlight too that this is since the 1960s, at least, Mexican civil society organizations, the international community has documented human rights violations committed by soldiers against civilians and with impunity. And so if you look at that back, it's decades of an armed forces that have been able to operate without really accountability to the victims and to civilian authorities. And this is in, operations to combat drug trafficking, also counterinsurgency groups, and then clearly the war on drugs launched by President Calderon in 2006, where you actually saw, I think, a significant spike in human rights violations because you had more soldiers interacting with the civilian population. In the case of the National Guard, just to highlight that since 2020 to date, there have been at least 1,100 complaints lodged against the National Guard for human rights violations before Mexico's National Human Rights Commission. So similar types of human rights violations that you alluded to that are linked to the armed forces. I would say a fundamental problem with the militarization of public security, which Maria Elena, Alejandro, and others have also highlighted, is that the armed forces are not trained to be interacting with the civilian population in the same way. And if they're not getting police training, even more so. So, police are meant to be addressing threats to public security by gaining the trust and cooperation of the population and using the least amount of force possible. In contrast, really, soldiers are trained to use force to overwhelm an enemy in combat situations. And so I think that's where you do see that disconnect, and perhaps, the most recent and tragic example of what risks you have when you deploy soldiers for these public security tasks was the case of excessive military force when the soldiers fatally shot a 4-year-old girl, Aide Mariana Perez, on August 31st, when they opened fire in the car that she was traveling in with her brother, her 7-year-old brother, who was also injured in Tamaulipas. So again, it really shows that disconnect between what soldiers are trained to do and then what they're being asked to do currently, and especially if they're not getting that police training. The other is the impunity issue. And I think, while Mexico's military code was reformed in 2014 to give civilian authorities jurisdiction over human rights violations committed by soldiers, impunity still is the norm in most cases, including cases that have gone before the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. Some of the main reasons based on our research and work have included that, one, national authorities don't necessarily investigate the chain of command. So of the few soldiers that we know have been investigated and sanctioned for crimes, often it's the one, the soldier that perpetrated the human rights violation or crime, but not who was giving the order. If you look at the Tlatlaya massacre, for example, there was discovered there was standing orders to patrol the streets and shoot down criminals in the darkness. And so these soldiers were operating under orders. So you really need to look at the chain of command and that whole structure that also allows these abuses to persist. The second, and I think this is the case for other crimes as well, is the civilian investigators usually are very slow in investigating military abuse, incomplete, and fail to produce the evidence needed for convictions in court. In fact, we'll have to see, even with the recent arrests in the case of the 43 disappeared students against members of the Mexican military, and there's several outstanding, how many of those individuals will actually finally lead to a conviction versus just an arrest warrant or an arrest itself. The other is military authorities engage in practices that often hinder civilian investigations, such as limiting their ability to access testimony from the accused or key witnesses, especially if those people are being held in military prisons, failing to investigate and sanction soldiers who tamper with crime scenes or give false testimony. And lastly, just contrary to the opinions issued by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, military prosecutors and courts continue to open their own investigations of human rights violations against civilians, arguing that they have jurisdiction as well because they're looking at whether these are abuse of authority military crimes. But what can happen, for example, in the Tlatlaya case, was that then some evidence and information wasn't actually given to civilian authorities. So there's lots of obstacles that I think we're going to continue to see, even if we're going to, how do you hold soldiers accountable in civilian courts for these abuses? What can be done? I think these are big picture issues and we don't have time, but I did want to flag, obviously Lopes-Obrador's messaging that, human rights violations are not tolerated. They're going to be investigated and sanctioned is important, but you can't change behavior of a security force with messaging alone. So I really think you need to look at what happens with any of these accusations of wrongdoing. You need to obviously strengthen the civilian justice system to improve investigations into crimes and human rights violations. We're also not seeing very much movement in that currently within the Fiscalia, and take steps to return civilian public security force to a police force with civilian policing training, which I think, as we've all heard today, seems very long in lots of challenges of when we might actually see that happen in Mexico. And lastly, just to flag an important thing to think about is the Inter-American Court on Human Rights did rule in the case of San Salvador Atenco, which was the sexual torture against several women in the context of repression by federal police and state police in Mexico, the state of Mexico. And in this case, the court actually ordered the government to create an independent observatory with civil society participation over the federal police and the police in the state of Mexico. This now, since there is no federal police, should actually, correspond to both the National Guard or the armed forces in general, and would be looking at how do you monitor and evaluate government efforts to increase accountability for cases like excessive use of force and other abuses. We have seen no movement in compliance with that ruling, but again, it's out there, something that the Mexican government should be doing to at least improve visibility and obviously accountability for these types of human rights violations and other crimes.
Thank you, Maureen. And I'm just going to repeat kind of what can be done, because I think a lot of our audience has been sending us questions about, how do you remedy a lot of the issues that have been touched upon during our conversation. So strengthening civilian justice system, civilian policing training, an independent observatory with accountability, the different armed forces and police forces. So I think that that's really important to highlight. We are going to transition now into our Q&A session. We have received some questions from our audience. And so I think we're going to start off with a question that we got for Alejandro Hoppe. Again, switching to Spanish. A pesar de las distintas controversias que ha generado el gobierno de la Cuarta Transformación, AMLO sigue siendo uno de los mandatarios con mayor índice de aprobación. ¿La militarización podría ser su talón de Aquiles? Este es para ti, Alejandro.
A ver, la aprobación del presidente yo creo que tiene varios resortes, ¿no? Y que no necesariamente están conectados con políticas públicas específicas. Hay una conexión emocional entre el presidente y una parte importante de la opinión pública, haga lo que haga. Déjenme ponerlo de este modo, ¿no? De hecho, la evaluación a su gobierno es mucho menos favorable que la evaluación a su persona. Digamos, muchos encuestadores han señalado ese contraste. Yo creo que aquí la apuesta por las Fuerzas Armadas, digamos, tiene, como ya lo mencionó Duncan en su intervención, tiene también hay una lógica política detrás de esto, además, digamos, de la facilidad burocrático-administrativa que le da lidiar con este tipo de agencias y no con agencias civiles. Las Fuerzas Armadas, en efecto, en encuesta tras encuesta, reciben niveles de confianza y de respaldo entre la población que son muy elevados, ¿no? 80% y más. Entonces yo creo que una parte de la apuesta de la militarización tiene que ver con vincular al proyecto político del presidente, ¿no? Con ese respaldo social inherente que hay en las Fuerzas Armadas. Aquí el problema, yo creo que aquí hay un problema con esa apuesta, ¿no? Que esa confianza, si bien es amplia, ¿no? Tiende a ser poco profunda, ¿no? Tú ves, bueno, si en vez de ver no solo estas métricas de confianza, estas preguntas que se hacen en encuestas, de usted confía en tal o cual institución, ¿no? En el ejército, la marina, etcétera. Eso primero lo controlas por la interacción, el nivel de interacción que tiene la población con esas instituciones, entonces no deja de ser tan impresionantes los números. Es decir, la gente tiene muy buena percepción de la Marina porque rara vez tiene interacción con la Marina. Deja de ponerlo así. Incluso el otro día encontré unos datos que me parecieron particularmente relevantes con la policía, con la Guardia Nacional en contraste con la Policía Federal. Un alto nivel, según las encuestas de INEGI, la Guardia Nacional tiene un nivel de confianza como el 75%, la Policía Federal nunca pasó el 57%. Pero aquí hay un dato interesante. El número de denuncias, el número de llamadas al teléfono de denuncia de la Guardia Nacional y de la Policía Federal son muy similares, ¿no? Uno supondría que mayor nivel de confianza generaría más interacciones positivas con el público, más voluntad de la población de acercarse a la autoridad y darle información relevante. No es el caso. Más o menos se denuncian los mismos hechos posiblemente delictivos con la Guardia Nacional hoy que lo que se denunciaban con la Policía Federal. Entonces, digamos, a lo mejor confían en lo abstracto, pero no necesariamente en la práctica. Entonces, esto pasa el talón de Aquiles del presidente. No creo que sea el talón de Aquiles del presidente, pero tampoco creo que obtenga de esto el impulso el impulso que espera, ¿no? Tampoco creo que opere en el sentido contrario.
Gracias, Alejandro. We remind our audience that you can submit all of your questions via our Twitter account at Mexico Institute or to our email, mexicoinstitute@wilsoncenter.org. Duncan Wood wants to jump in on this question. So Duncan, it's all yours.
I just wanted to sort of supplement what Alejandro was saying, because I think that, if you look at the opinion polls in Mexico right now, not specifically about the Guardia Nacional, but what Mexicans are really concerned about right now, after 2 years of COVID, after economic kind of complete stagnation, implosion, recovery, etc., what they're really concerned about is public security right now. And so if this is something, if this is a development that improves public security, then this is a good thing for the president. If, as I and many others suspect, it won't actually make that much difference in terms of public security, and then you have these problems of transparency and governance and loss of legitimacy and trust, then I think that, you know, this is bad news for the president. And I think we have to put it into the broader context, or an even bigger or broader context, which is to say that, you know, we're in the last 2 years of this presidency. The presidency is running out of steam. There's not a lot of new stuff coming through. AMLO in the first half of his presidency could say, you know, this is all about the fourth transformation of Mexico. I've got all these ideas. We're making these things happen. In the second half, it's kind of run out of steam. There's not a lot happening. If this is what he's really, you know, staking his credibility and his legacy on in the second half of his mandate, then I don't see this as being a game changer at all.
And I think to your point, Duncan, I mean, where, you know, depending on which poll you actually, you know, review, but where AMLO tends to poll lower is on security issues and public security issues. So it might be a way, right, a remedy towards the end of his sexennial, and also paving the way for the Morena candidate to perhaps kind of, you know, improve his ratings in this subject matter. María Elena, recibimos una pregunta para ti, y ¿la militarización representa un retroceso democrático para México? Está aquí, ¿no? María Elena, ¿me escuchas, María Elena? Creo que estás en mute.
Sí, perdón, no escuché mi nombre.
No, no.
Sí, sin duda es un retroceso democrático para México. Sí, desde 1946 en México siempre mantuvimos un equilibrio entre fuerzas civiles y fuerzas militares, donde las fuerzas civiles mandaban sobre las militares. Ahora lo que estamos viendo es que las fuerzas militares están mandando en muchos ámbitos, simplemente con la cantidad de obra pública que les han dado, acompañados de un presupuesto que, como decía, no está dentro del presupuesto de las mismas Fuerzas Armadas, sino que lo toman de otros presupuestos. Bueno, pues esto está cambiando el equilibrio. Y lo vemos muy claramente en la forma como se están conduciendo generales de alto rango del ejército, que hoy tienen una gran preponderancia, pero también lo estamos viendo en sentido contrario con otros generales y almirantes que en bajito nos dicen que no están contentos con lo que está pasando, que hay un gran descontento al interior en la parte baja del ejército con los soldados y marinos que están sobreexpuestos al trabajo, que están cansados y que ellos no están obteniendo beneficios, ¿no? Y sin embargo, los de arriba sí los están obteniendo. Y además, por supuesto que perdemos libertades y derechos, porque, como ya decía Maureen, estamos teniendo un desgaste de las Fuerzas Armadas en el que cada vez vemos más violaciones a los derechos humanos y que dentro de las Fuerzas Armadas pues es muy difícil investigarlos y además corregirlos, porque generalmente con el tema del fuero pues ellos deciden cómo se corrigen o no. Además, tenemos otro problema. A las Fuerzas Armadas no les interesa el trabajo de seguridad pública, como ya lo decía Alejandro, y lo vimos estos 3 años con la Guardia en el observatorio que tenemos, donde él también participa. Bueno, pues lo que vimos fue que violaron todas las leyes de seguridad pública civil al no preparar a sus miembros como policías, al no tener ningún control sobre ellos, ningún control civil sobre ellos, y que todo fue una suerte de simulación. Entonces, realmente lo que se llevaron al ejército con la Guardia Nacional fue un cascarón. En realidad no tiene elementos, pero lo que sí se llevaron fueron las 43 funciones que tenía la Policía Federal y que hoy las tiene la Guardia Nacional, ¿no? Y luego parece como un poco paradójico que quieran las funciones, pero no quieren ejercerlas, porque en realidad pues no detienen a la gente, no quieren ser primer respondiente, no quieren responder como policía. Y en este caso, pues no es culpa de los soldados y los marinos, sino los jefes, ¿no? Además de todo el atropello que ha habido en contra de los derechos laborales de los policías federales, que ahora que se la llevaron de manera ilegal a la Guardia Nacional, a la Sedena, pues están quedando los, no sé, entre 17 y 22,000 policías federales que quedaban, pues están quedando en el desamparo total, porque la ley que mandaron, aunque sea ilegal, dice que van a cesar a todos estos policías federales. Y yo me pregunto, bueno, ¿qué va a pasar con ellos? Porque llevaban algunos 10 o 20 años sirviendo a la institución y de un día para otro se quedan sin trabajo. Entonces, sí creo que por supuesto es un retroceso, y es un retroceso también para la democracia, porque está probado que las Fuerzas Armadas no deben de tener el mismo nivel y menos mayor nivel, y ahora ellas son las que están mandando sobre muchos temas que siempre habían sido civiles en México.
Sí, justo Marilena, nos había llegado una pregunta sobre si había divisiones, ¿no? Dentro de las Fuerzas Armadas sobre lo que está sucediendo. Entonces creo que nos acabas de contestar en gran parte esa pregunta. Dr. Deer, we received a question for you. Does the militarization in Mexico as a political move provoke a window for controlling and manipulating the next presidential election? And is there a risk for a coup?
Sorry, you missed my The short answer to the second part of the question, I think the risk of a coup is exceedingly low. And I'm not sure I understood the first part of the question. Could you repeat that for me, please?
Of course. So the question says, does the militarization in Mexico as a political move provoke a window for controlling and manipulating the next election? So I think, does militarization, is it a political move to kind of take control over the result of the 2024 presidential elections in Mexico? Were you able to hear me?
You froze for a second, but I think I got it.
I apologize. So that was, I feel like that would have been really hard to understand what I was saying if I'm frozen. So
No, but because it reminded me of what the first part of the question was. So no, I don't think it does, but I go back to my sort of hypothesis early, right? Why is AMLO interested in doing this? Does he love the armed forces? No. Does he necessarily trust them? Maybe he does more now, as he's learned over the years that you tell him to do anything and they do it. I think the concern is longer term. My view of the Mexican military over the past 30 years that I've basically been studying them is that it is a very disciplined force and deliberately subordinate to civilian control. What some of the other panelists have brought out, though, is this strange environment in which the military is placed in positions where they're dictating and giving orders to civilians. We haven't used this term either, but it's fundamentally altering the nature of what the armed forces are. And to reinforce what some of the other colleagues have said, the armed forces aren't happy with it. And if you want to really know how unhappy they are, talk to retired general officers or admirals, and they are up in arms privately, off the record, of course. It's curious and perhaps understandable that both Sandoval and Ojeda have been obedient, right? But more recently, I'm increasingly concerned that instead of pushing back, at least gently, on some things, they are saying yes to everything, and that does give one pause. One minor anecdote that tells you how concerning this could be over the longer run. I just learned recently that in the Heroico Colegio Militar, they are now giving an undergraduate degree in Seguridad Pública, right? Not Seguridad Interior, not Seguridad Nacional, Seguridad Pública. That's not their role. And so, best case, this exceedingly high level of militarization that we're seeing under AMLO ends with his term. But worst case, either his successor, right, likely to be from Morena, continues, and how does the military view itself? You know, once this, if it takes root and this becomes the new norm, that should give us all pause.
Yeah, and I'm going to let Duncan jump in here, but Duncan, if you can also answer, you know, how hard would it be to reverse everything that AMLO is doing currently? Would it be a very hard process, or do you think that it would be something that could be undone quickly in Congress?
I think that's why it's so important to put the militarization of public security into the broader context of AMLO's relationship with the military and what he's doing in terms of militarizing public works projects, for example, and giving the military an economic role. Because, you know, and going back to what was said earlier on in this dialogue, in this conversation, about the fact that the military was skeptical of AMLO before he came into office. And, you know, he's militarizing public security, which they're not happy about, as Craig has just told us. But on the other side, he's giving them a role in the building of banks and hospitals, the Tren Maya, the Santa Lucia airport, giving them not just the role in the construction of those projects, but actually a stake in the profitability of those projects, which takes us into an entirely bizarre realm, which is much more like, you know, China than it is like the United States. And that's why I think, you know, this is such a fascinating area to look at in terms of public policy, because there is very much a, you know, I'm going to need you to do this for me, but in exchange, I'm going to give you some benefits on the side. How do you then start to take away those benefits? Which speaks to the question that you're raising, Leila. It's one thing that you would go to the Congress and say, okay, we're going to stop this, we're going to demilitarize public security. But how do you take away the other things? How do you begin to extract the Mexican military from the day-to-day lives of Mexican citizens? And I'm going to stray into the anecdotal here, okay? Which is that even before the desfile militar, the feeling on the streets of Mexico City these days is so radically different than it was, you know, 2, 3, 4 years ago, which is that you see the military everywhere. And that may have been something that was much more common in other parts of the country, but all of a sudden in Mexico City, you know, you see the military. In traffic on the Periférico, you know, you may have seen those videos of people having their cars, you know, searched, you know, whilst they're stuck in traffic. That's something that we didn't see. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad for public security. I'm just saying that the Mexican military is much more present in the nation's capital than it ever has been in the 25 years or so that I've been, you know, dealing with Mexico. So getting it out again, I think is going to be a real challenge, particularly because you've built in all of these incentives on the side for them.
Well, and there seems to be a contradiction, sorry, in terms of, on the one hand, AMLO tends to criticize former presidents, right, their security strategies for putting the military on the streets. And now he's kind of doing it, you know, a little bit more than halfway through his administration. So I think this is another, you know, contradictory point that's very interesting to analyze. But Maureen, I know that you want to jump in here as well. So be glad to hear your thoughts on this.
Just quickly on, I think complementing what Duncan said, I mean, even just on the security part, when Peña Nieto tried to push forward the internal security law, which in a sense was going to legalize the armed forces role in public security, one of the pushbacks was, what is your exit strategy? So what will you do to have a more civilian force in the long term? And I think that's what we're seeing now with this vote this week in the Mexican Senate. See if it happens in terms of extending even more even just the armed forces role in public security. Of if it does go up to 2028, when are you ever going to start developing some sort of exit strategy for this? Precisely, I mean, just in the security realm, as Alejandro alluded to, if you start weakening so much civilian policing, where would you draw from on that? So I think there's not a strategy, just even on the security, apart from construction of airports and others, what do you do to really bring back any civilian nature to Mexico's federal security force? This also has implications for US cooperation. Who are we working with? If you have a domestic US law enforcement agencies and then their counterpart is the Mexican military, and I think there's a lot of question there. I mean, there's certainly as people have seen, there are restrictions now from Congress on US funding for having the military have public security roles. I think beyond that, because then who do you collaborate with? I mean, there's Department of Defense cooperation, as Craig could probably talk about, with the armed forces in Mexico for counter narcotics. That's pretty much the limit in terms of funding. But what does this mean for security cooperation when the US spent years building up or working to support the federal police with equipment, with training? And so now there's been like an impasse on that, but a real question of what happens next. And just to flag, because one area we didn't talk about that I think is important in terms of what they are working on in terms of beyond public security is immigration control. And this is something where the National Guard does have within when it was created in 2019, a role in terms of checking people's documents, but a real risk again of militarizing even more immigration control in Mexico when you have very vulnerable people that have been through oftentimes trauma and then being confronted oftentimes with security forces. We've already seen a few cases of arbitrary executions, National Guardsmen firing on vehicles and whatnot. So I think a real concern of just how many other things can the National Guard or the armed forces get involved in, and what do you do in the long term to create a domestic, for example, stronger immigration institute or another agency that would be supportive of border control measures? Thanks.
Maureen, and it also lends the question, if it's going to complicate the way that security cooperation is done between the US and Mexico with the armed forces now, was that an intentional move on behalf of the Mexican president or not, right? Is that something that he thought that would be good in terms of, not relying so much on the United States in terms of security cooperation? So I posed that question because we received it from the audience, but I'm also going to send out another question. I know Alejandro and Maria Elena want to jump on what we're talking about now. So I'll just add a question. If anybody wants to respond, please feel free to do so. This is from Ambassador Tony Wayne. Does AMLO have any response to the high impunity rate in Mexico? People get arrested by not being brought to justice. How does he defend that? Alejandro?
Primero, regresando un poco a lo que mencionó Duncan y lo que mencionó Maureen, creo que desmilitarizar la seguridad pública va a ser más sencillo que desmilitarizar otras áreas de la administración pública. De hecho, como han construido la Guardia Nacional, la han construido como un cascarón administrativo. Incluso la iniciativa que aprobaron la semana pasada, hace unos días en el Congreso, le quita a la Guardia Nacional las 23,000 plazas administrativas que tenía de la Policía Federal. Entonces, la dejan sin plazas presupuestales, sin equipos, sin instalaciones, o sea, la dejan como cascarón. Entonces, una administración futura podría potencialmente cerrar la Guardia Nacional en 24 horas sin pasar por el Congreso, por pura decisión administrativa. Entonces, en ese sentido, digamos, esa ruta podría deshacerse. Más complicado lo que está pasando con, por ejemplo, la obra pública, ¿no? Con servicios públicos. Porque allí sí, la creación de un sector militar empresarial sí tiene implicaciones muy significativas. Al ejército lo están metiendo a terrenos de política pública donde nunca había estado. Cosas como las tarifas de uso aeroportuario, cosas como políticas de desarrollo regional, cosas como políticas ambientales, en el caso del Tren Maya. O sea, lo están metiendo a ese tipo de discusiones donde nunca habían estado. Pero además hay otra cosa. Una vez que ya están en algún área, digamos, económica, pues ¿por qué no expandirse, no? Si ya tienen aeropuertos, ¿por qué no tener aerolíneas? Si tienen aerolíneas, ¿por qué no tener hoteles, no? Si tienen hoteles, ¿por qué no tener flotillas de taxis? O sea, genera un incentivo para sobre todo para los oficiales, de expandir su rol económico. Y ahí sí, echarlo para atrás, pues va a tener una implicación presupuestal gigante. Sobre el tema de la impunidad, a ver, creo que México tiene de manera muy esquemática, tiene 3 grandes problemas. Uno, la mayor parte de los delitos no se denuncian. Los delitos que se denuncian no se investigan, en su mayoría, y los delitos que se investigan se procesan inadecuadamente. Nada de eso se resuelve poniendo bots en el terreno. Para eso tendrías que estar, uno, desformalizando, desburocratizando y facilitando radicalmente la denuncia, muy probablemente sacándola del MP y poniéndola con la policía. Segundo, quitando el mando de conducción que tiene el Ministerio Público sobre la investigación criminal y permitiendo que las policías investiguen. Es decir, hoy por hoy en México solo 8% de las policías pueden investigar delitos y eso genera un cuello de botella gigante. Y tercero, volver al sistema acusatorio, realmente acusatorio. Los estándares probatorios del sistema tienen que aumentar. Hoy es extraordinariamente sencillo mandar a alguien a la cárcel sin investigar absolutamente nada y sin probar absolutamente nada. Y eso genera todo tipo de desincentivos para construir capacidades en largo plazo.
Gracias, Alejandro. María Elena.
Sí, con respecto a lo que ya señaló Alejandro, creo que lo dijo muy bien. Solo agregaría que la Fiscalía General de la República, que tendría que estar tomando todos los delitos del fuero federal, realmente no lo está tomando, porque está tomada la Fiscalía por un hombre que no admite tomar las carpetas que vienen de los estados, que no le interesa solucionar el problema de la impunidad que tenemos en México y que no tiene ninguna empatía con las víctimas. Y agregaría además que sobre lo que ya se dijo de las Fuerzas Armadas y de lo que dijo AMLO pues, durante todos los años que estuvo en campaña y lo que al terminar decidió por quedarse con las Fuerzas Armadas, me parece que hay un punto importante en una conferencia que dio, bueno, más bien en una plática que les dio al periódico de la Jornada, donde él dice que por él desaparecerían las Fuerzas Armadas, pero que no está en sus manos, ¿no? Y eso me remite a pensar en que si realmente el presidente quiere fortalecer o desaparecer a las Fuerzas Armadas. Yo creo que en lo inmediato las quiere fortalecer y de esa manera lo está haciendo. Sin embargo, a mediano plazo me parece que sí es posible desaparecerlas por la cantidad de problemas que van a tener hacia el interior por corrupción. Entonces, no descartemos que el presidente en realidad no tenga confianza en las Fuerzas Armadas y simplemente las está utilizando, ¿no? Y me parece que ese punto también es importante porque al final del día, por supuesto que tenemos problemas y lo van a tener también empresarios americanos que quieran entrar a México a hacer negocios, porque como ya decía Alejandro, pues muchos de estos negocios van a tener que irle a pedir permiso a las Fuerzas Armadas o compartir el negocio con ellos, ¿no? Entonces, sí creo que vamos a tener problemas en ese sentido y, por supuesto, insistir en el tema de derechos humanos, porque lo que estamos viendo es que con tan pocas detenciones, como ya decía Alejandro Ope, sin embargo, hay muchísimas violaciones a los derechos humanos y no están actuando, ¿no? Por esta política de abrazos, no balazos, bueno, si se le puede llamar política, en la que no los dejan actuar, les dan todas las facilidades para hacerlo, pero al mismo tiempo el presidente les ata los brazos.
Maureen.
Quickly, in terms of Ambassador Wayne's question, I think the other part of this is just the budget. There is not the investment that you need in Mexico to build up the justice system as it should be. And so if you look at even priorities much more into the defense budget or security budget versus the budget that you would need for the fiscalias, the attorney general's offices at all levels. So you have understaffed fiscalias, you have prosecutors that, even in case of human rights violations, disappearances, for example, have 400 cases for one prosecutor. How are you going to be able to investigate that? So there's a resource part of this too. I mean, there's a capacity part that we certainly need to Mexico build up more and more of the capacity of prosecutors, of forensics, of all of the operators in a justice system, but it's also a budget issue. And so if you're not providing those resources, and actually we've heard several states have budget cuts, then you're basically asking already somebody who's overworked and understaffed to do even more. And I think that's where you lead to such low prosecution rates, because the system itself is really overwhelmed. And I think that also reflects a question of political will. What are you really focused on? If you're not going to win any points, maybe investing in the justice system, but that's what you really need long-term if you want to put a big dent in impunity in Mexico.
Dr. Deer, before I let you jump in here, I do want to send you a question that we got from the audience for you. Given the Mexican military's high level of discipline and ability to execute, what are the prospects that it can mature the civilian policing capabilities of the National Guard, including its investigative capabilities, ability to properly handle evidence, and work effectively with judicial authorities and prosecutors?
So let me answer that, and I want to come back to something else in a second. I think the short answer to that question is limited, right? They have limited experience in doing those things. The rank and file has limited desire to learn to do them. Where are they going to, from where are they going to import that expertise? You know, that it's a fine skill. There are limited numbers of people who had done that before. Those skills atrophy over time. It's a concern, right? I mean, you would have to almost go externally to import that kind of expertise. Where do you go? You know, before you might have gone to Chile or Colombia, maybe not so much anymore. Do you go to Europe, to Spain or something like that? That's a concern. What I had raised my hand for is Maria Elena brought up something that when I had spoken earlier about, I don't want to do the conspiratorial thing, but since she raised it, I'll go there, right? The whole issue of whether, and I'm familiar with the interview that AMLO gave to La Jornada, where he says, yeah, if it was up to me, I'd get rid of him, but I can't. But isn't, in fact, he attempting to do so slowly by, again, undermining their legitimacy, giving them missions that they aren't trained for, that they don't want to do, that they don't perform well, again, undermining their credibility and legitimacy. And I wasn't at the parade this year, but I heard from many friends of their dismay of the limited numbers of actual Army and Navy troops marching and the large number of Guardia Nacional that were marching. And so and I know of retired general officers and flag officers who believe firmly that AMLO is trying to undermine the credibility and legitimacy of the armed forces so that they will atrophy and go away over time. That's why, if you look at the budgets, Guardia Nacional keeps growing, and it's concern. And I think from a U.S. perspective, that is something that we probably need to pay closer attention to.
Thank you, Dr. Deere. We're unfortunately running out of time, but on behalf of the Mexico Institute, I want to thank everybody that joined us virtually today. I also want to thank our incredible panelists, Alejandro, Craig, Maria Elena, Maureen, and Duncan, for their valuable and insightful comments on such a pressing topic for Mexico. We hope to see you all soon in the near future. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you again to each of you.